welcome to the Unlearning Economics stream. I have with me today Beatrice Cherrier, who is a historian of economic thought, and we are going to chat about just that. So thank you for coming, Beatrice.
Thanks for having me.
So Beatrice is one of these people, like a lot of my guests, where we've sort of been mutually followed each other on Twitter for a while, and we've had a lot of piecemeal exchanges. But it's kind of good to actually be able to speak to you for an extended period and like pick your brains about the history of economic thought, because I think we share a lot of outlooks about it, but the difference is that I just sort of whine, whereas you actually do work and produce research in the history of economic thought. And also a lot of your papers. I mean, I've read your papers, I've read your blog posts across the years. I went, preparing for this, I went back over all of your publications, and it's like every paper you've written, I'm just like yes, like that is exactly the type of paper that I would write if I were better at writing papers. I don't know, but like literally every topic is just fascinating. So I really enjoyed reading your work today.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Some of them are hard sells, so I'm happy to hard sells either to historians or to economists or to others.
Yeah. I mean, so let's go on that, because I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not an easy discipline to get into. When I did my PhD, we were there was one historian of thought in our department who you probably know, Terry Peach.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, he was like a really nice man, and he loved what he did, but I remember like going to see him and being like, "Shall I do history of economic thought?" And he was basically like, "No, unless you want to be unemployed." Like, it's a difficult field to be in, right? And it's not that you always get the positive feedback. So I mean, like, what motivated you to go into it, and how have you found that dynamic?
So I so I knew from the beginning that it would be hard. I was not lied to, and so I started that there is that French strange French educational system. So I did the classe préparatoire. And so I basically I entered and then I did a curriculum in economics, but I entered in the third year directly, having barely taken a course in economics. I did mostly math, and I was just surprised by not probably not like you, like I expected something different, but it wasn't. It was better or worse. It was just really I expected such an old style study of institution and capitalism. And I got into the third year at l'École Normale Supérieure where I was, and it was like economics of uncertainty. A lot of people were specialized into that. So a lot of math of uncertain behavior, rational behavior under uncertainty. And I was like, yeah, wow, I don't understand why the discipline looks like that. And then there was a process. I guess I went into history of economics because I didn't got any good explanation for why I was being taught that kind of stuff. So I was good at it. I mean, I came from a math background, but it was like, okay, why is economics the way it is, like this? And I ended up doing a PG in history of economics. So one thing I wanted to preserve is basically having a sort of database. I mean, working from data in some ways. And because the natural ways to go, if you actually wanted to understand the discipline, was more philosophy of economics. And at that time, to me, these people doing philosophy of economics, I took some course in philosophy of economics, were more, to me, sort of armchair philosophers. And so I met my PhD supervisor, and very simply, it was Philippe Fontaine. It was trying to create in France a new tradition in history of economics that was history of economics is history of science, basically. That didn't exist yet. We're in the 2000. And so basically, even for my master, it actually sends me. I did my master on value and theorizing, which is what I did in my PhD. And I was working on Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish economist who got a Nobel Prize. And basically, very quickly, it told me, okay, you have to go to the archive. And I went to the archive as an early PhD student, and I was like, yes, these are data. So I can understand what I'm going to do there. So people are telling stuff about history, it doesn't really seems to be database. unlike what they're doing elsewhere in economics. And actually, if you want to tell stories, you have to look at data, and archive are good basis to understand why people think what they think and why economists do what they do. So I'm just gonna start from here, and that's basically what I did. That's why I actually started doing some history of. I didn't have any proper history of economics training, so I didn't know a lot of stuff about Smith and Ricardo and Marx and whatsoever. So I just learned. I was really learning by doing, basically.
They didn't offer any like courses in the history of economic thought. I think that
No,
was similar for me.
oh, I mean, it stopped at Keynes, but like,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's still very much the same. It's changing slowly, but at that time, if you still had a history of economics, I had one history of economics class, but it was very late, and it was, I think it was, I mean, it was Smith to Keynes, and my first chapter of my PhD was on Myrdal, and then I studied Friedman and Marshak, and I went up into the Cold War and I'm specialized what's happening since the 70s. So still what is being taught to students, if there is one course, it stops at Keynes. So it stops at where I start, and it also stops at where the foundation of what economists do now in terms of practice start, which is a problem. So
That's
if you stop at
so
Keynes,
interesting.
you're not as a student, you might get a very interesting stuff or sort of like long-term transformation of capitalism or long-term transformation of all objects in economics like interest rates, growth, wealth, inequality, but you're gonna get nothing at like why economics is mathematized, should it be, why equilibrium, why rationality, why the use of data, why the status of theory, all these things. I mean, they were born in World War II, right? So you don't get a lot on this.
I mean, it's a really interesting observation what you've said. It's just Smith to Keynes because that is it's one of those observations where as soon as you said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's obviously true. They just stop at Keynes, and I suppose there's this perception that there was historical economics, right? You know, starting with Adam Smith and Ricardo and you know Malthus and Marx and all that and Marshall and then Keynes, and that was more that was kind of almost the classical era, right, where people wrote long books and they didn't do that much maths. But shortly after Keynes, maybe you have it turns into modern economics, and then we don't need to do the history of thought anymore because we've just got modern economics, and that's you know that's the way it is, and we don't need to reflect on such frivolous things as you know who came up with what and when and why.
And I also think it's the moment. So, as you say, the title of this course is History of Economic Thought. And I guess World War II is the moment when it stopped being what economics is about. So it's more about, of course, it's more about models, and you don't teach about the history of models the way you teach about the history of some thinking. And it's more and more about practice and data and programming and all sort of stuff, and very much less about thoughts. So you have to research it differently. You probably have to teach it differently. So it's, I mean, yeah, Keynes is to some extent a natural stop. So if you actually want to teach history of economics as history of science, it doesn't mean you actually believe that economics is a science. It means that's what the identity of what economics is about from World War II onward is economics as a scientific practice, whether you believe it or not. So yeah, it's different stories. It's not Heilbronner worldly philosopher anymore. So it's a different kind of thing.
So I mean, for you, like, what would you say some of the benefits have been of studying the history of economic thought? You know, what do you think gets lost when we don't do it?
Oh, so you have to distinguish between these two kinds. Just explain if you don't do history of economics as history of economic thinking, you lose a sort of long term. So you lose many things. You lose a sense of a long-term transformation of ideas and how old some of them are. And if you don't do history of economics as history of practice, which is what I do, you lose any sense of reflexivity about your own practices. So you lose innocence. First, you lose innocence of why do I do what I do? Why do I model? Why do I use math? Why do I use this hypothesis? What's the history of my concepts? And so it's not something I teach, but if you're an economist or if a user of economics, at some point, you're going to go into questions like, is what I do a science? And is there any progress in what I do? So I don't have any answer to that. But if you want to be confronted to any reflexive sense, so how much absolute progress is there, or is what I'm doing depending on economic history or the institutions I live into? And I guess any practitioner or any user of economics is going to ask this question. In answering this question is basically going back to decades ago or centuries ago and ask what has changed. Am I going to solve, for instance, am I going to get better economic knowledge if I get better techniques? Or what's the amount of subjective choice should I need to do? So, for instance, my student, what is the story I tell? Because I tell the story of the transformation of economics since World War II. It's very much a story about engaging as, okay, economics canonical history is what has changed in that period is that we have better models, we have better computers, we have better data. So there is progress. And a lot of what I teach is basically you have to think for yourself about what is going to be solved and what is going to be better in terms of economic knowledge and models with better computer, better data, and what problems these things are not going to solve, what methodological problems these things are not going to solve. And I hope that students actually exit my course with maybe not better answers because the answers you get by using economics or practicing economics, but at least they exit my course with better questions and better definitions.
Yeah, I mean that's a good answer. It sort of reminds me of what you said earlier, right? Because you were talking about economists use data, right, and increasingly so they use certain types of quantitative data. But you were talking about going through the archives and how that is a form of data, right? But that's something that's been lost in the contemporary discipline. It's only that you'd accept kind of a statistical data set. You wouldn't necessarily accept archival work as empirics, but I guess I mean obviously you would say that's completely unjustified.
Yes, so it's a separate so to me it's a separate issue. An issue that relates to our status as historian and economic within the field of economics is like we have a low status because I think mainstream economists have lost their literacy into understanding qualitative work. I mean, now it's very standard to do quantitative work. The identity of economics is increasingly we're good data scientists or we're good even causality specialists and stuff like that. So we can look into sort of any data work, including sort of the one that is done by meds and the one that is done by physicists and anything with data we can evaluate to some extent. It might not be true, but that's what is more and more claimed, or that's what you see through the practice. And I don't know whether this is true or that, but basically what happens when you do that is that anything that's not research in terms of quantitative techniques disappears. So basically, economists cannot evaluate what's a good qualitative study or what's good archive-based work or what's good survey work, for instance, or what's good anthropological work or whatsoever. And they cannot evaluate whether it's good or not because they've lost interest into qualitative research. And then what happens is that then that kind of work is pushed on the side. And that's the kind of work I do. Not merely that, we do have quantitative history as well, but it has to go with, to me, it has to be paired with some sort of qualitative research as well. And this is not something that a lot of people can evaluate, and that's a problem.
I mean, I think what you'll see in the best case scenario in mainstream economics these days is there'll be like some interviews or some historical context, but it's very much like motivation or it's just sort of supplemental. It's
Mm.
not necessarily the case that economists would regard a set of interviews as like actual kind of rigorous evidence that they could use as the main event. Like, I don't think that would ever be accepted into not even a top journal, just almost any journal, right?
So that's actually an interesting. So I don't have an answer to that, but something. So I teach history of economics to mainstream master students in economics, and I've noticed in the past year that they tend to go back to using more and more surveys, and that's new. And I know the history of how surveys have been dismissed in the history of economics. I mean, people were used to do a lot of that to understand like firms pricing behavior, the like decision behavior, like what Katona was doing was the Michigan surveys in the US was all about sort of understanding that, and it was gradually dismissed as a good methodology from economics, and it sort of took roots in marketing instead. That's part of the story. And in those applied fields where it was still there, for instance, in contingent valuation, I don't know if those who listen is going to know that, but this is one techniques that is very much used in environmental economics. For instance, if you want to value, for instance, a lake or a mountain or whatever, and it's non-use value, how are you going to do? You don't really have much other choices than asking the people, the citizens, how much they value it, and try to recover sort of their own valuation. And for that, you do use sort of a technique that is called contingent valuation, and it's survey based. It's been hugely criticized by academic economics, though it's very much used in courts, for instance. And what you see now as sort of I see a lot of a kind of return of the survey method into economics. So it's very recent. I cannot historicize that, but I'm looking closely. I was like, okay, it was a widespread technique. There has been controversies about, for instance, whether you have to pull businessmen about how they do price goods or whether you want to do it differently. And the people who were doing surveys, I mean, they actually lost. And now it's sort of tiptoeing and back into economics. I want to understand how that plays out, because since then economists have basically lost sort of the ability to work with qualitative techniques mostly. So I'm not sure who's going to play. We'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because there's what you're talking about is this kind of like maybe denigration of what people say, you know, in interviews, what they say their preferences are, like stated preference, contingent valuation that you mentioned, and interviews with businesses that are about like their pricing practices, because that's regarded as like cheap talk and it's not real. But then when people go into the market and they make their decisions and they set their prices or they go and buy something, that's regarded as real. And often, I think, I mean, I've looked at contingent valuation and revealed preference quite a lot, and often what you get is kind of there's this presumption that, say, somebody says they value a nearby lake like really highly, if you ask them, then the presumption is that they're just wrong and they're exaggerating because actually they wouldn't pay that much for it, right? And so like there's all these criticisms of like what they've said, and they're like, oh well, the real value, you know, when people actually go to visit the lake and pay for a speedboat on it or whatever, that's how economists might estimate that. That's the real value. But I mean, you know, clearly that comes with a whole host of like difficult philosophical assumptions that aren't always, you know, scrutinized.
So yes, but at the same time, so economics are super ambiguous. It's very interesting there. Ambiguous stands toward, asking the agents, because there are all sorts of technical issues, and as a behavioral economist, you know better than me
Sure.
what's up there. But I can see throughout the history of economics is two big reasons, or well, at least one big reasons why economists have to do that more and more is, this idea that they actually want to be value free, or at least they don't want to be attacked or suspected. Economists don't want to be suspected of smuggling their own valuation into economic analysis. The only way you're going to avoid doing this, like, valuing a lake or valuing a life or valuing a good instead of economic agent, is to say, oh, no, no, we're not going to decide instead of agent. We live in a consumer society and we're trying to be a value-free science. If you're trying to do that, you cannot you cannot smuggle as an economist your own values into the analysis. The only thing you can do is to ask people, okay, what's the value of their life? Or what value do they give to this good? Or what value do they give to this candidate? Or things like that. So at the same time, just like you said, it's like super hard to do technically. People have been knowing that since the 50s, and then there was the behavioral economics revolution and much debate. And at the same time, that's really the way economists went to try to not be suspected of being ideological. So asking people about the valuation of quality, that's how you do sort of price statistics more and more. Like hedonic pricing is about trying to recover that to some extent, and contingent valuation is about that. The value of statistical life methods is about doing that as well. You can find it in a lot of places.
Yeah, that's really well put. I think, yeah, I mean the even the idea of a value, right, on something, I think like I just think people don't have a value of something really. Like they've got like what they might pay at a specific moment, which depends on like, the amount of income they have, their mood on the day, their circumstances, who they're with, like loads of factors. And then they've got like what they might say if you ask them one way, but they've also got what they might say if you ask them in a slightly different way. And it's just like the idea that there is a value out there of, say, a local park, right, which is the type of thing we might be talking about, I think is potentially just completely like wrong.
Yeah, but that's what separates economics from, for instance, if you discuss with like physicists or biologists who are trying to do, for instance, either climate models or like pricing models or models to forecast about anything, they exactly don't understand that. They say, okay, we don't need value as quantification. But the thing is, in economics, the mainstream economics, it's not about evaluating quantity or prices, it's about evaluating utility and welfare.
Yeah.
So you have that sort of like stuff that stands in economics in all your models in between quantities and sort of like price quantities. Oh no, you actually the end game of economics very often is to do welfare analysis. So you have to move from quantities and value and prices, if you want, to utility and welfare into sort of policy advice, which again, other scientists who come to economists from elsewhere, like physics, biology, psychologists, they don't do that. That's clear.
So you think that economists are smuggling in their values more so than those other scientists, would you say, or?
No, so the paradox is that so as not to be accused of doing so, they have created that sort of like, we are going to do models with welfare analysis, okay, and people are going to tell us about their welfare, and in doing so, it sort of introduced that sort of big sort of utility welfare analysis things in every economist models that in the end seems less objective to every users like policymakers and business than just saying, okay, I want to know how much someone is going to consume and how much someone is going to pay, and that's it, right?
So it seems to evade the question, but it doesn't actually manage to if you examine it properly.
No, probably not.
Yeah, probably not. I'm really enjoying the dynamic camera that you've got, by the way. So for anyone who's just listening, Beatrice has like a dynamic camera that's like following her. Did you realize that it keeps like zooming in and like moving around as you move around?
Right. Again,
it's very good. It's very good. It creates like a kind
gamers
of
kind of equipment.
It's gamers equipment. Yeah, it creates a proper sort of like an epic film type feel to what you're saying.
So that's basically equipment for World of Warcraft being used today to do some sort of economic podcasting.
Okay.
That's the reason why.
So I mean, let's. I'm going to hit you with some. I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a second.
Sure. Do that.
So with the history of thought, I think one of the most common perceptions that I encounter, and this goes back to what we were saying about, there was classical economics, then there was Keynes, then there was modern economics. Most economists would think that it's all water under the bridge, right? We've had the history of economic thought and what good there was in historical thinkers is now a part of the mainstream. What bad there was has been ejected. You know, we don't read what is it, the Principia Mathematica, the Newton's original treatise. We don't read that. You know, why would we go back and read the General Theory or the Wealth of Nations?
So if we do that, saying this has an underlying very strong view of progress, which is what I was mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I don't know as a practitioner in economics, mainstream or orthodox, what your own notion of progress should be, because I'm not a practitioner myself, but at least I know that you should think carefully about what you think is progress in economics if you're a practitioner. So basically, like old ideas being dismissed or embedded, it's weird because so I think I'm not sure we're still there yet. So it's a notion of progress that is actually taken from natural science, like the idea of a cumulative body of knowledge. I can see it was very much there in the post-war when you actually economists trying to start emulating physicists at first, and then engineers and so forth. Some believe epistemologically really believe that you could have laws alongside like natural laws. Many economists actually believe that because they were trained as engineers and physicists. I mean, that's the story of like it's huge immigration shock from Europe under Nazism into the US, is that basically all the people that were trained in physics and engineering and math and statistics couldn't find a job necessarily in there, and there was war work and kind of an integration of a like allocation and physics, for instance. And so they did find job into sort of like war work, and they became economists, or they became allocation specialists, or they became rational choice theorists, whatsoever, coming from a background in physics and biology. So taking with them the idea that if you're a scientist, what you're supposed to do is basically find laws, so at least be general enough, and that's a cumulative process of dismissing Popperian stuff. You cannot prove something right, but at least you can prove it wrong. So you have to progress by like proposing new theories or studying new data and new phenomena or new stylus facts and dismissing some explanation, going with other explanation. So I can see this reflected in the way economics has been done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think sort of the epistemology, underlying of epistemology of economists, even mainstream, has a bit changed after the great financial crisis. So if I talk to my students, quite naturally, what they would endorse is not this, is more sort of like Danny Roderick. Obviously, he's not responsible for that, but his book, Economic Rules, actually reflects that very well. We write models for circumstances, and what we need to have is not sort of a cumulative process of they're good models. We have to find the good models and we have to improve the good models. Okay. It's more something that we need to have a library of models and we're going to pick one for such and such circumstances. Yeah. So it may have changed. It may have changed a bit in that respect. And if you do this this way, if it's sort of like better adequation to circumstances, and do you have the right techniques, and do you have the right data, and do you have the right narrative, then you're not in a framework where past ideas are either dismissed or integrated into the body of economics. Okay, you cannot have that view, and if you cannot have that view, well, it's more interesting to go back to monopolistic competition or inflation. How did the people with the previous episodes of inflations back into the 60s or in Venezuela, for instance, rather than in the US or in the UK, think about it? And it's there you get some space for history of economics, right? Because it's going to make you think.
It's absolutely, the best way to learn about the value of history of economic thought, I think, is just like exposure. I can't count the number of times, and I'm sure you'd be very similar, like when I've been reading someone, an older sort of thinker, and I'll be like, this is amazing, like they've got loads of insights that I haven't picked up, from my sort of standard economics education. There's always all sorts of gems hidden in, any major thinker, but probably a lot of the minor ones as well, right? It's just like, I think because economics is such a complex subject, it defies credulity, I think, to think that you could, have it all wrapped up till now, and know everything historically that we need to know just from the current models.
Yeah, I agree. If you go back even century, but even if you go back to, for instance, if you're doing anything with a sort of monopolistic competition, for instance, and you go back to rereading Dixit and Stiglitz, or if you well, any basic models, or if you do stuff with risk and uncertainty, and you go back to reading the paper by Ken Arrow, you're gonna see that there is a model and there is a lot of stuff. There is a lot of narrative around that. I mean, the people,
Hmm.
what I find is, even so, I do work mostly on the history of mainstream economics so far. We can actually discuss why I do that afterwards, but that's what I do. And I find that people are often like the people who create new new class of models are often very, very cautious about that, very knowledgeable about the data, the techniques, the institutions, and usually more diverse. And also, if you do the archive, more in conversation with people that are very far from their own practice that you would acknowledge. Okay. Um, for instance, I did some archive recently on Kin Arrow, and it was in constant conversation with people like Paul Ehrlich, for instance. And that really feeds his thinking. And you might think, okay, well, Ken Arrow is kind of like the Uber sort of mainstream economics, and he invented fundamental models in so many different topics in economics, and it was constantly talking to philosophers, and reading philosophers and biologists and ecologists and psychologists and stuff like that. And so being super cautious about how to apply these things. And this is really what students actually have as exactly the opposite of that, because by definition, they start learning model from textbooks.
Yeah.
And if you start learning model for textbook, it's not even the real model. It's a super digested. You have a good textbook in everything you write seems obvious, which works at the beginning to some extent. I mean, I followed trying to have sort of new styles of textbooks with, for instance, the core textbooks and whatsoever. I mean, you have to be fast and efficient when you introduce someone to a new discipline, and it's super hard to do it fast, efficient, and more subtly and more diverse in a more diverse way that you were doing. So you need to have a rational at some point. But I mean, once you become a user, or once you become a modeler or practitioner in economics, you don't want the obvious. You just want to know how it is to actually come up with new practice and new ideas in the
Mm.
dark, and not knowing what you do, and not knowing ex ante how you define your concepts and whatsoever. So you need exactly the reverse. And that you can recapture with history of economics and reading old text and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Yuan Yang the other day, and we were talking a little bit about the level of rigor of the mathematics, but the comparative lack of rigor about what the mathematics represents, right? And just not delving into those assumptions. And history of thought definitely helps you to do that.
Yes. So yeah, it might be both the history of practice and also the history of concepts. So for instance, like I remember an old long tweet storm by Joe Michel. Like that's 100 different ways of viewing interest rate, or what is
Yes.
interest rate.
Yeah.
No, I mean that I mentioned this because, well, so I'm doing more history of practice and I'm talking about modeling, but that kind of stuff too. And if you're training to be a macroeconomist, okay, maybe you cannot. So one big question is, so when do you want to introduce some history of economics and philosophy of economics, for instance? And I'm not necessarily proud of it, but many people say, okay, we should start by that kind of perspective. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure because they do history of economics practice. And I rather think I've mostly taught introductory economics to non-economists, and what I try to do is not to be diverse and subtle. Is on the contrary to give students the essence of what was the distinctive mode of thinking of the economists. And so, if you do that, you have to caricature to some extent.
Sure.
But if, for instance, once you actually move to late bachelor or master and whatsoever, if you're training to become a macroeconomist, you need to think about deep down what you think interest rates is about. And there are hundreds of ways you can actually frame interest rates, and you need to be
Of course.
taught these things. I mean, that's super important. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the 100. Yeah, Joe Michel, by the way, for everyone watching it, it was one like equals one theory of the rate of interest back when people
Exactly.
used to do that on Twitter. Um, yeah, but I think he must have reached about 100 different theories of the rate of interest. It's like probably one of the biggest. It's funny that actually because it's something that theories of the rate of interest. I don't think someone from outside economics would think that that would be a controversial topic, but it actually is one of the most controversial, like what determines the rate of interest, and it's like very ideological as well. Um, Beatrice, so I mean, you've mentioned this already, right? But you do specialize in economics since World War Two, so I
Yes.
do want to delve into that a little bit more because you see a lot of trends, right? We've talked about the formalization, people call it. That means more maths, essentially, in a nutshell. The Americanization of the discipline, the centering of it on America. I think, and the rise of the Chicago School as well, and
Yes.
you could probably put the rise of macroeconomics in there. So, I mean, I don't know. It's quite a lot to summarize, but we have plenty of time. Can take it step by step. But I was just wondering, sort of, how you view this shift in the discipline and how these things might be linked.
So, I mean, to me, it's a good, um, yeah, it's a good. To me, World War II is basically watershed in the history of
Mm,
economics. So I did touch on immigration earlier, and it's not just a contextual data. I mean, it's just sort of like basically it's a good watershed because all sort of stuff in economics shifted extremely fast, like in 4 years. So that sort of immigration does means that there is an influx of people not trained as economists but trained as hard scientists into economics very fast. You also have war work, and because of war work, you don't have time to develop a new theory of whatever for like 20 years or so. I mean, so it does basically transform. War work is basically how to allocate stuff more efficiently. And so you have to devise all sort of it. So you have a tool shock, basically. You have like input output tables, you have national accounting, you have linear programming, you have uh, all sort of like statistical techniques, the seeds of general equilibrium, the seeds of game theory. Because game theory is how like big superpowers have to have strategy one towards the other. So all this just like you have to think this very fast, and then you have like decades to refine them. So you have this. You have a huge change in the demand for economics as well. So for first, of course, the military should learn that economics is useful, and this is the military that's going to fund the social science for like 20 to 30 years after the war. So it's super important to be interested to your funders, and governments also learn that. I mean, you exit basically World War II by having the establishment of the Council of Economic Advisor, the notion that economists should help stabilize unemployment and prices in the US, the Beveridge Report, the foundation in the UK, the foundation of the École Nationale d'Administration and the planning economists at the government in France in various countries. Again, a big shock. I mean, so like by 50, you actually have an institutional space for economists in many European and American countries in the way you have for no other social science or humanities. Okay. So I really want to emphasize that you have a tool shock, you have supply shock, and you have demand shock. I mean, if I am I'm
mm,
going to summarize. And so basically, it's a good place to say, okay, this is like you actually listen to Keynes. You have like two or three videos of Keynes that you can actually view on Twitter and
mm,
on YouTube, for instance. It's super interesting because he discusses exchange rate and industrial policy and monetary policy And you're actually looking into how any economist in 60 or 65 talks, and it's just like 30 years apart, and it's totally different.
Is
It's
it
totally
so?
different.
There's more than one video of Keynes on YouTube. I,
Oh, maybe.
oh,
Okay. Sure.
I only thought he was. There was the one of him going talking about going off the gold standard, which I guess was
Yes, exactly.
1931. Are there more videos of
Maybe
him?
not. Maybe that's the only one
Oh,
that's
I'll have
I
to look. I was very excited when you said
okay.
multiple videos. But yeah,
Okay, maybe not multiple. This
yeah,
one exists, and this one is kind of representative. I was like, if you actually show it to students, they're gonna tell you, um, okay, that's a very they might tell you, I recognize that this is about economic topics, but I don't understand what his argument are.
yeah,
That shows you how the literacy has changed and how the style has changed. Very fast. And not only this, but of course you have so you don't only have a shock, but you have what historians of economics is actually viewed as a narrowing of what are acceptable ways of doing economics. So going from what is called interwar pluralism to post-war neoclassicism. And in the 40 years after that, there is no such thing as an heterodox in the 30s, right? You have different ways of doing economics, and that's it. Okay, some very theoretical, some very. Are you okay? I
yeah. I'm
was
just
wait. I don't,
sneezing. I'm just sneezing.
I
Just
don't know
ignore
how.
me, everybody. You can carry on talking. I'm listening,
uh,
but I'm just trying to sneeze.
No problem. I was wait. As we say in French.
I'm okay.
So
I'm okay.
yeah, you get in the 30s. You have to remember that even as close in the sense as in the 30s, you don't have such thing as good ways and bad ways of doing economics. You have lots of debates like Methodenstreit and all sort of stuff, but you have people that are super theoretical, people that are super inductive. Think about the NBR and business cycle at that time. You have people that are super institutional and they're gonna look at unions arrangement and unions discussion within such and such industry and whatsoever. You have people that are more like mathematical, like physics oriented, all sort of stuff. And what emerged in less than 30 years after the war is basically a hierarchy. Okay. It doesn't mean you don't have any diversity. To me, there is more diversity that canonical histories actually have it. Okay. Even within the mainstream, in fact, there are a lot of different practice in economics. But what you have is a hierarchy. So you're a mainstream economist, and at the top of mainstream economics, and more, if you are at the top of mainstream economics, you have to get your PhD in sort of like 10 university at best, and then there is a creation of what is heterodoxes, basically. So if you don't do economics the right way, whether if you're Austrian or post-Keynesian or a complexity economist whatsoever, then and that's very new and that goes very fast. So that's my reason to actually consider the period going from, let's say, 40 to uh, where you can go into economics to a sort of like consistent period in which economics is basically done differently than
Yeah.
before World War II.
Yeah, that was it was a really, really good answer to quite a broad question. I mean, it was interesting that you noted the rise of hierarchy, right, and a hierarchy of methods. I think that caught my attention because I guess it does feel now, and obviously I wasn't around, well, even 40 years ago, but like before, it seems like you're painting a picture where there were lots of different accepted ways of doing things, and there were different traditions, and they had debates, but none was better than the other in, let's say, the 30s, right? But by the time you've reached the 80s, you've actually got this kind of dominance of a smallish group of American journals with certain standards for what methods you would use, and this just really shut down debate and shut down pluralism and potentially set the discipline back.
Do yes,
Yes.
do what kind
Do
of a you want
I
me
mean,
to
I don't know.
explain?
Do you agree? Is that have I stated that deliberately strongly to see if you agreed or whether you might
No,
qualify it? I don't
so
know.
there are two questions there. There is
Yeah.
they sort of like questions of there's a positive and a normative question. So the
Sure.
positive question is there more hierarchy today in economics, intellectual, institutional, prestige, political, if you want, whatever, than, let's say, 70 years ago? This is a positive question, to which my answer is yes. And there is a normative question of whether this is bad, to which my answer, not as a so it's a normative answer. So it's my response as being a historian in a working in a marginalized field. So that's one thing. But one first thing is that are we ways more hierarchical today than we were 70 years ago, and what's different the way we actually became so is yes. I mean, many of us have documented that in journals. I work on the John Bates Clark. My co-author Andres Fornsik actually wrote a paper with Kevin Over on the AEA. Lots of people, the people who've done like semi-quantitative, semi-qualitative work on all the markers of a hierarchy, basically show that if you're getting prize or if you are getting a powerful job as president of the AEA or a nominating committee or getting a prize or whatsoever, today you come from a pool of much more narrow training and programs in maybe even topics that you were like 70 years ago. That's just really a fact. So yes, the profession is so one way to do that is actually track across time markers of prestige and see who get them. And another way to actually see that is to compare with the structures of other disciplines. Okay, be it
Right.
sociology or even physics and whatsoever. And here too, I mean, the sort of like dominance of the top five kind of phenomenon. It's really hard to see this from inside economics. Even if you were in heterodox economics, you're still in the incentive system. You are at one end of the incentive system, but you're still in the incentive system. When you talk about this with other profession, I mean, they are like, "What are you saying?" Even for what fun anecdotes you have is that I already had a discussion with an editor at Science or Nature. I don't remember. And he basically told me, I mean, it's insane your culture in economics because you are the only discipline. When I contact a specialist and tell them, would you write a paper for Nature and Science? I mean, we are the king, right? So no one ever refused that. And it's the only discipline in which people are going to say, oh, sorry, no, I'm busy trying to get my paper into the American Economic Review. And editors in the editor at Science are like, I mean, that's crazy because you're going to have ways more impact on other science and public discussion
Yeah.
if you publish in Science and Nature. And economists are the only ones say, oh, no, I'm busy trying to publish in the American Economic Review. And you can see through these anecdotes what we tend to show through historical work is that yes, hierarchies is being strengthening and economics is super atypical compared with, I mean, I don't want to deny that there are hierarchy in science. I mean, they're
Sure.
in every science, but even taking this into account, economics is atypical in terms of the strengths of hierarchies in that discipline.
And how insular it is as well, right? The hierarchy. So it's like the hier. What I mean, from what you said, it seems like the hierarchy within science and the science journals, where you've got Science and Nature at the top. Those journals do have quite a lot of impact, kind of outside their disciplines, or within a wide range of disciplines, I should say. But also, on public debate, right? You regularly see things reported, whereas it feels like economics journals, like obviously economics is quite influential, but it's like outside of a relatively small group of people. I mean, who reads econometrica? Like it's very much an economist journal, right? On the whole.
So it's a question that's harder to answer than it seems because so there are two questions here. One is the question of interdisciplinarity, the question of
Sure.
insularity, if you want, and another question is a question of influence.
Yeah.
So let's take the question of insularity. So you know that sort of like there was that famous paper by Fourcade and Ollion and Allegan on the superiority of economics, to which a team led by Engrist
Yeah.
actually answered with that paper in gel called a Inside Job or Deep Impact.
Yeah, yeah.
That says, okay, see, economics is not insular because it's it's more and more cited by other sides, which is a very weird way, very idiosyncratic way to define interdisciplinarity because you want to know how it goes both ways. So I'm divided on, so there is that sort of like quantitative battle, if you want, and then if you look into how other science do in fact influence economics, to me it's an answerable question because, or for instance, I did work mainly on mainstream economics and sort of core mainstream economics, like especially macro. I can write papers after papers after papers in the history of macro without ever having to engage with other science. So how economists discuss with other science. So that would be quite insular. At the same time, my PhD advisor, like Philippe Fontaine, and the people around him, like Roger Backhouse, is basically his own his own sort of intellectual agenda spanning over several decades. And I was trained as a graduate student into that context, is to understand the ties between economics and other science, and especially other social science. So he has a lot of colleagues in him that keeps documenting that in fact many economists had relationships with sociologists and joint projects. Maybe it was not in top university, it was in sort of like different types of institutions. I can see that to some extent. For instance, I've been working on central banks and they've been more ties with engineers and psychologists and other kind of people. I do a bit more on the issue of environmental economics as well, and they have sort of like interdisciplinary conversations as well, even sort of super mainstream people. So it's kind of hard to know what's going on in other social science does influence economics. That's one thing. And for instance, in your field, like behavioral economics, there is a research by Alexandre Truc. It's what these people who are doing quantitative work show is that, yeah, of course, behavioral economics is very much influenced by psychology. But when they want to publish in economics and when they want to publish in other science, they actually frame things and eventually do things differently. Okay. And for instance, some economics might even switch fields, so which is kind of interesting. So that's for interdisciplinary. It's not a satisfactory answer because I don't have a final answer on that. Influence is also very complicated because so you have to so you have a tension here between economics say, okay, people never actually listen to us, and what policy we actually want to implement, and everyone else basically saying economists are the most influential on policies, and you can even say on sort of business structure if you look into Amazon and market design and stuff like that, maybe. But just let's handle policy right now. I think one convincing way to reconcile that is the line of economic sociologists like Elizabeth Berman and Don Hirschman and others, and I kind of agree with that, is that there is a difference between being influential in terms of substantive ideas, which economists have managed to do more as a thinkers like Friedman, neoliberal thinkers, for instance, if you wish, but they're not just acting as it happens that they derive their expertise, for instance, from being top economists. But I mean, Friedman, as the free to choose writer or the capitalism or freedom writer, is not an academic economist. He's a political thinker, if you want. So that's one type of influence. It's kind of, to me, it's kind of rare. It's not easy to document. For instance, I wrote one paper that documents that one economist had a substantial influence on policy, as when Walter Heller convinced Kennedy to implement a big tax cut in the 60s, and I can track that the language of a Walter Heller's, who is a fiscal economist, memos actually shift Kennedy's view of debt and the output gap and stuff like that. And he changed his mind and he adopts the framing and language of Walter Heller. So this is the one time I can actually document an influence. Documenting influence, for instance, all that stuff about, economists as a neoliberal framework of thinking, you have a chicken and egg problem. You don't know if Friedman actually changed the mind of people, or like Hayek or whoever you actually want to go with, or if these these policymakers or think tanks or the car brothers or what picked up on such and such ideas because I mean, it's kind of complicated. So to, in terms of ID, to what extent economists are influential is not an easy thing to document. I think it's one thing that has been more convincingly documented is how economist models actually frame concepts within which you can actually think about policies, like notion of, efficiencies, like cost benefit analysis, like this kind of tools, quantification tools, a notion that you have to estimate risk. So cost benefit analysis is a really good example. Like going from it's been a technique frame for military related projects and then natural related projects, then being endorsed into all aspects of social policies, okay, wages, discriminations, and so forth, and then being written into law with Reagan, for instance. So this is basically saying, okay, we're not sure what influence economists have in terms of actual policies, for instance, competition policies or macroeconomic policies, but we can document very well that economist tools have framed the way people think about justice and efficiency and leaning towards efficiency rather than justice or fairness or stuff like that. I think you have a good histories of that.
Yeah, a good example I think of the latter is like the Green Book in the UK, right? So you probably read the Green Book, but
Mhm.
for everyone else, it's a policy document that sets out how to basically appraise all major policy decisions, and it's something that the Treasury has to do. And it uses like cost benefit analysis. It uses doctrines like market failure, correcting market failures, and things like that. And basically, it's quite a lot like an economics textbook in places. So you can see the influence of the ideas there. But yeah, as you said, I mean, influence of individual economists is much harder to
And
track.
even the politics. So for instance, Beth Derman, an interesting thing that she documents. Not everyone agree with that because if once you've said, oh yeah, but there's two things. There is whether you actually want to argue that economists twist policies to be more free market or more conservative or more right wing, whatever you actually want to do is one thing. And the other thing is whether you actually think economists are gonna twist policies in terms about being about efficiency and cost benefits and stuff,
Right.
but you're still not sure what type of policy this is going to vindicate. Because what she shows is that basically in the 60s, it's more left-wing economists who actually implemented this tool at the government. And then it was taken up by more free marketers from the 80s onwards.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can say, okay, one thing in having an influence is people are actually going to adopt your conceptual framework, but it still doesn't tell you which kind of policy you're going to do. But
Yeah.
as economist, well, I like telling these stories to my students because it's really a story about unintended consequences, and I want to make them think about if they actually provide new tools and new models. Usually, they don't feel responsible about the salesmanship of that. To other economists, yes, but not to the public. And I kind of tell them if you're not giving the guidebook that goes with your own quantification and model or whatever, people will circulate it and use it however they want, and you're gonna lose you're gonna you lose ownership on how your tool or your model is being used, and that's important. Maybe you don't care, but maybe you care, right?
Do you think economists have not been aware enough of that kind of jettisoning of the caveats? I suppose as your framework goes from the textbook to the policymaker to the public. I think it's very difficult. It's extremely difficult for your ideas not to be hijacked, right? In fact, they probably will be, but it seems to me that economists haven't always done everything they can to make sure that the best version of their ideas can get out there. They're not too bothered about that, right? They're just like, I'm doing the economics, I'm solving the model, I'm doing the statistics. That's right. that'll speak for itself. Whereas there might be a lot of kind of political considerations that you need to think about if it's going to go out into the public sphere.
Yeah, to me, um, they've tried to abstain from sort of providing guidebooks at some point
Mm.
because I mean it's dirty, right? So they would actually do the analysis and don't go into this sort of politics. Yeah, I've got one example that I teach my students is got a in the history of environmental economics. So that's one paper that's been written by a law scholar, not a historian of economics, named Bain Franta. And it's studying, so it's not about policy. It's about a private sector, and it's about agnotology and climate, like trying to create that sense that we don't know what the consequences of a rejecting carbon is on global warming in the end, and to do that, to create that sense of we don't know the science and
Yeah,
foodiness with scientific conclusion. Exxon and Total and other companies, they did hire and to actually try to convince, for instance, the US not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. They actually enlisted a group of economists to do some sort of cost benefit analysis of, for instance, pricing carbons and stuff like that. And he documents what the companies did and what the economists did in terms of cost benefit analysis. And he went to interview the economists who did that. And what the economists said is basically, we knew very well how to quantify the cost of
yeah,
pricing carbons and what the US consumer would lose in terms of uh, having to pay for carbon emission. And we couldn't document at that time the benefits of doing so because the science of the physical consequences of carbon emission was not as settled. So we didn't. Okay, we didn't quantify that. And
yeah,
so they say what we gave to the company that commissioned this cost benefit analysis is we have a precise estimation of the cost. We're uncertain about the benefits. Okay. And what it became in the political sphere is their cost, there are no benefits.
yeah,
Therefore, the US should not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. And you have quotes of these economists who were interviewed like 2 years ago saying, we should have been more careful. We should have
yeah,
understood better. So basically, what we did as scientists is there is some uncertainty here, so we're not going to
yeah,
quantify because we're cautious. And what it became, it doesn't exist. Okay. So I certainly want economists today to be aware of this what's the science quotient, or I don't know this, or whatever actually becomes in the public sphere. True.
yeah, yeah.
And so, for
Absolutely.
instance, I same was I don't have data, and this doesn't exist. Same thing. So the all people working on the same thing again and again and again because you have very good data and leaving sort of whole areas, like for instance, some branch of inequality research unexplored for like 30 years because you didn't have the right data. And in the end, what it creates is just it doesn't exist.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. It's also it's actually a common problem as well, even outside economics, because I remember reading about how scientists communicated climate change, and they didn't. They kind of had this attitude of like, again, we're right. The data support us that climate change is happening, which is true. But then they didn't have any type of like way of arguing their case effectively in the public, right? So it's just like, I think this kind of view, like, I guess it's a technocratic view in a way, isn't it? It's like, we can just do the maths, and that's all we need to do, and then the truth will out. But clearly that just doesn't work, and you need to have a much more holistic perspective if you're going to try and be influential as economists are and do.
But also you have to, that comes back to the question of interdisciplinarity.
Mm.
So if it's not economists who are going to use your models and tools, you need to be able to sort of like converse. For instance, a good case is lawyers, for instance. If you do cost benefit analysis or if you do provide tools on, for instance, like discrimination and wages, like my colleague Cléo Chassagne-Rizagouche has done some history of that. As I mean, they are actually economists are gonna have models about how much of this wages is due to discrimination, but this is to be used in courts And so lawyers have a different uses of quantitative evidence and causality and stuff like that. And if you don't have this conversation, same with COVID. You can have a COVID models, but it's going to be used uh,
Yeah.
by public policymakers. It's going to be used by people in the medical fields or whatsoever. If they don't know how you talk as economists, they're not gonna understand how to use your model. And I don't think many economists are being trained into communicate a bit more, but having conversation with people with different epistemologies, no. So that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one other thing that I think you've written about over this period is like how some of the methods of modern economics, because we often get this, you've discussed it, right? We've got this, the rise of kind of free market Chicago school economics following World War II. And that kind of coincides with the idea of like neoclassical economics. So that's like kind of optimizing utility, maximizing agents, profit maximizing firms, equilibrium, all of the standard stuff that we'd associate with neoclassical economics. It was often associated with the free market. However, and you've already touched on this a bit, it's actually the case that a lot of that maths was used, and it's called optimal control theory, right? Which is suggestive because a lot of it was used because it was much more useful to governments who were like looking to intervene, right, during wartime, but also after, because it was like it was almost like you solve the maths, and then it's like you've got that lever, and you can push that, and then this will happen, right? So I guess there's this strange place that neoclassical economics occupies because a lot of people, and people are doing it in my chat now, they associate it with free markets because of Milton Friedman and people like him, right? But then there's this whole other side of it, which is actually much more towards the planning side. And I think that speaks to the political economy of how it became dominant because governments liked it for that reason, right?
Exactly. So for instance, when you're looking so people like Friedman and Hayek and Chicago economists and like Posner, even Buchanan, they have a they add a lot to, so all these people that I just mentioned, by the way, none of them, even not Friedman to some extent, do have fully neoclassical models. If you take the example of Friedman, for instance, Friedman only at a very late in his career did write sort of like general equilibrium type of models because he actually wanted to talk to people who are doing that. But if you look at the monetary history of the United States, it's to me it's hard to call it a neoclassical
Right.
economics methods in the way that you probably understand neoclassical. It's very institutional. I mean, he got a PhD from Columbia and from the NBR. There's a lot of economic history. It's a lot of data collection. And you have the discussion about the quantity theory, but I mean, it's one equation. It's about accounting. It's not about it's very, very different from what Lucas, for instance, was doing in macro. I'm just about like 10 years later, Hayek same. See, Buchanan created public choice. So I don't have a very clear ideas about how sort of like neoliberal thinking actually relates to neoclassical economics. For me, it's kind of different things. Um, so what I find useful in terms of thinking about neoliberalism is, for instance, Phil Myrowski definition of neoliberalism, it's very much about information and it's very much about an epistemology. It's very much about saying people on their own cannot process information, the market can do that better.
Yeah.
And at some point, we can build market to help people do that better. That's one view, for instance, of mechanism design. Okay. Um, because he has a definition of neoliberalism that doesn't equate it with neoclassical economics. To me, saying neoclassical economics is neoliberal, it's not just that I disagree. To me, I found it meaningless. Okay. For instance, the basics of market design, for instance, which is being used to provide market solution to some allocation issues, for instance, it's been framed by people like you, which I've been trying. There is just a biography by his son that came out that I haven't read yet, but I've been working on and off on people like you, which in that generation of early market designers for a few years, and I still cannot decide how does it relate to any politics. You can view it as super free market, and you can view it as super communist if you want. Okay,
Yeah.
so to me, I'm sorry, I cannot. And if people are discussing that in a chat, I don't have a good answer to that. It would be better to probably um have both a an interview with someone that does the history of market designer as someone that's opposed to neoliberalism, like Edinika or Phil Mirowski, for instance, and to talk to people who
Mm.
do Hayek studies that are fairly pro Hayek because they have a more refined view that's usually the neoclassical, they view that so Hayek is not a neoclassical. Okay. So
Yeah.
what I do call neoclassical, and I feel I work on neoclassical people, are neither generally the free marketers or the anti-free marketers. For instance, neoclassical is so I did a lot of history of macro in the past years, and now I'm turning back more to history of micros, and I've done that also, though I have not published on that, and I do go back to doing history of public economics. Okay. And so I'm not sure how you're going to classify that in your own neoliberal, not neoliberal classification.
Mm.
But neoclassical economics are people like Musgrave on one generation, Samuelson, and the next generation it would be Stiglitz, Atkinson, Mealis, Diamond. All these guys, what they are doing is basically studying market failures.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're studying market
Yeah.
and departed from market. So maybe that's neoliberal, but it's been a whole life basically studying market failures and so government intervention. So how do you fit that into the neoliberal studies? I know that neoliberal studies are huge in political science and
Mm.
political economy, and I read a lot of that, and I do find it interesting. I just don't know how to come and talk to these people from the kind of histories they're telling, because basically my own categories don't fit them. And people are just going to say, oh, you're defending economists or whatsoever. I'm just like, no, it's not what I'm doing. It's just that notion of free market from inside the mainstream of the science. And the guy who actually graduated for MIT or LSE or whatever, I cannot tell these stories using that kind of wording. That's just my problem.
Yeah,
I know it's
it's a really tricky question for sure. I mean, I was at a workshop about economic experts and politics, and I remember um, being told that I'm trying to see if I've got the book there, but I can't find it. Yeah, being told that when they ask kind of the free market politicians, what their influences are and what their reasons for being free market are, economics comes up like much less than I think a lot of people would suppose. It's actually much more of a philosophical position, and I feel like that's kind of a representation of what you were saying there, right? Because it's like I think there's maybe a misperception that it's like libertarianism is pure economics, when actually I don't think it is, and I don't think it sits that well with neoclassical economics. I'm actually just reading Thomas Sowell's book. I don't know if you've ever read Sowell,
yes, but it's
Basic
fascinating.
Economics, and it's like it's a really weird book because what he's doing, although he doesn't say it, is he's doing neoclassical economics, but just without any of the caveats about market failure, right? So he's just like doing like basically a perfectly competitive market and assuming it throughout. But that for that reason, I think it's a really ineffective book. Whereas if you read something like Capitalism and Freedom by Friedman, that's much more philosophical, right? And he's talking about the freedom of the market system, not kind of abstract theory.
Yeah, I think Sowell is an understudied. Lots of people have been saying we should write more on Sowell, and that's true because he's an influential intellectual. But for instance, for me, who does history of mainstream economics, I'm not sure he is an influential figure on the body of mainstream economics. I
Mm,
think his influence is mostly on the boundaries of economics or even outside economics. Plus,
yeah.
I think it's so to me, one of the key aspects of the definition of neoliberalism and the way it's not the same as classical liberalism is that classical liberalism to me is kind of free market, so market left free, for instance, while to me, neoliberalism is another type of ideology that realize that market should be built and controlled and have a stewardship by either expert or economists or the government, something like this. Market needs to be built and protected, and there are people who can operate into markets better than others. Okay, so it's really, to me, that's what a lot of what economists were doing. So for instance, if you want to allocate airport slots or kidneys or whatever you want through market-like mechanism is if effectively really much about what the public policies from the 80s onward are about. But I'm not sure that the label free market does adequately reflects that complex
Yeah.
interplay between sort of experts and the markets.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's just sort of this idea of neoliberalism as like more of an active role for the state actually in creating markets. I mean, that's I think Morosky talks about that, doesn't
Yes,
he?
and
Quite a length.
I'm fairly so I don't agree. I don't agree with the way Phil frames lots of his histories. He's got like very strong specific character that are influential in the way that I don't view that. But
Right.
I mean, his definition of neoliberalism, whatever you're gonna do with it, to me is more precise and more operational than talking about like free market in the wide.
Yeah.
There are people that are free marketers, but to me they are not as influential as sort of like people who are supposed to build markets or
Yeah,
yes.
it's a really interesting distinction to make, I think. And if you look at like auctions and like auction theory and stuff like that, right? And like the creation of like carbon permits and I don't know. I'm trying to think of other examples, but like I mean, even bailouts to an extent, right? You could argue because you know these things have been a component of neoliberalism since its inception, really, and you know these are active state policies, and the introduction of markets into public services as well. We've had a lot of that in the UK. I think you might have had comparatively less in France, which you could be thankful for. But like, yeah, we've had these sort of very complex mechanisms that aren't just you know they're not just markets. They're like it's a public service, but with a very complicated market that's been designed within the public service, which is an active thing for the state to do, and it requires you know experts and you know economists and lawyers and resources and everything to do it. So it's not just saying oh you know laissez-faire. It's not that at all.
Yes, exactly. It's not laissez-faire. It's not free markets.
No.
And plus, if you study the history of this sort of like new institutions, like for instance, international carbon permit, the US was convinced to push that kind of solution when they actually set up a sort of mechanism that would help them solve the problem of acid rains
Yeah.
in the 80s and 90s, and it was pushed by a bipartisan alliance. So if you look at who's pushing for this,
Yeah.
lots of people have lots of reason to push for this
Yeah.
on the political spectrum. And so these stories are pretty complicated to excavate and then teach and then yeah, tell
That is
basically.
one of economists' successes. Actually, it has to be said. That design of permits for reducing the acid rain, because they did actually basically manage to eliminate it. I think those schemes, right? Roger Backhouse talks about that. Your co-author.
Yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
so they're yeah, and that's the like existing history we have about international carbon permits shows that it didn't scale up. And
No.
they can be like so again, you can actually picture this as a success of neoliberal policies that is pushed by economists, but
Yeah.
there are just not economists in that stories. And then to what extent do you think it's neoliberal? Okay, because it's a constructed market. It's an international negotiation as well. So yeah, it's complicated story. I don't think it's just told in a finite way, in a definitive way for the moment.
Absolutely. So let me change gears a little bit. I hate that phrase, but I find myself saying a lot of phrases that I hate when I'm speaking live. But you've written quite a lot about women in economics as
Yes.
well. I was going through some of your articles on it. So I mean, you know, in a nutshell, what is your view of where the discipline where the discipline was with gender equality, maybe, you know, you could even say sort of pre-World War II, around World War II, and where it stands now.
So what is interesting is that one of the key takeaway we have from our collective research on women in
Mm.
economics. One thing that has been documented not by me and my generation, but already by the previous generation of historians like Evelyn Forget and Kristen Madden and people like that, is that we know that the situation of women in economics was better in the 20s than it was in the 50s, for instance, because they were more, just like the institutional barriers to having a women complete a PhD in economics, like access to libraries, culture, recommendation letters, finding a job, and whatsoever. It was actually harder to go through in the 50s and 60s than it was in the interwar. And for instance, for someone like Lynn Ostrom, she tried to do a PhD in economics and she couldn't, and that's why she
Yeah,
did a PhD in political science. I mean,
yeah,
long story short, but that's what she would say. And then it improved again, and that we know because we have data. Again, it's not just our work, but it improved again with the feminist revolution of the 70s that went into science, and among the science that went into economics. And then what even economists documented that then it went backwards. In that, for instance, the wage gap between a woman professor and a male professor of economics in the 90s or 2000s was bigger than when it was before. Okay. So what is interesting and that what one takeaway you actually want for now for current discussion is that sort of like the representation of women in economics um, follows a cycle. So, for instance, right now we're all about giving prizes to women and recruit women, and and we're gonna do that probably. So my prediction based on that is that we're gonna do that for 5 years, and then we're gonna be like, okay, we've done all we could, and we're just gonna forget about that. And absent
yeah.
institutions that sort of stabilize the representation of women in economics, it might go backward again. So that's one thing. And the second takeaway that's for us, so that's something that's common among science. One way economists is special is that so that's something that we actually found out through studying the archive of the CSWEP, for instance, the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession at the AEA. And there has been a lot of discussion about positive discrimination, about setting a job market, even setting up childcare and stuff like that. And what is very interesting is that when they discuss this, the stages of women in economics, economics do tend to use labor economics frameworks. Okay.
Mm.
So what is interesting is that discrimination is both something that women in economics have experienced and an economic object. And so you literally have, for instance, Friedman that is going to say, uh, yes, women are discriminated against, but the market is going to solve that, like the market actually solved discrimination for us Jews. This is literally right that, right? So you shouldn't have sort of priority hiring or sort of like sort of any kind of positive discrimination. You have people like Arrow who actually view discrimination like an information issue.
Mm.
So hence the creation of the job market, for instance, because that's the problem of circulating information. And you have people that, because we're talking about the 70s and sort of Marxist economics have a sort of like second use in the 70s and the creation of UOP and radical economics. And you have economists who actually study power relations in society and on the labor market that are going to tell you, well, no, there are power relations at play in economic science, and we actually need to solve that.
Yeah.
So you can directly see that economists are using their own framework to actually answer this question. And underlying this is that how many economists are going to believe in the force of markets to actually solve discrimination against women is actually going to tell you whether you should have active policies or not. And at some point, so that's the kind of conversation they have in the 70s and 80s. And in the late 80s and early 90s, you have a rift. So CSWEP has a empirical mainstream labor economics, and the people who have developed first radical perspective and then feminist perspective actually leave and create YAFE. Okay. And they do have a different take on power relation and discrimination in economies, and they also have a different take on the status of women in economics itself, basically.
So this notion of going backwards, yeah, it really concerns me. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned like do you contrast the 20s and the 50s? I think if I'm remembering correctly,
Yes, yes.
and it's interesting because I couldn't help but think of football because women's football was quite big in the early 20th century. Sorry, and then it was banned by the FA in England. And then it sort of went backwards, and it's only now that it's like beginning to recover. So it's just interesting, like this idea we have of like progress, right? It's like you were talking about that earlier, but if the discipline went backwards then it could have gone backwards with lots of other things as well. And I was wondering, like, you kind of hinted at this, but do you think the narrowing of the discipline methodologically had anything to do with, and it'd be difficult to determine causality, but I think it's all just linked, had anything to do with the relative decline of women in the discipline as it became more mathematical and formalized, and more neoclassical? Did it become less relevant for women? Did it become were women more excluded, or are those different? Are those different trends? Are they related?
So it's true. So yes, but if so, it should have played differently in the last 40 years. So
Mm,
um, they have been historically, they have been like great theorists, like John Robinson, of course. But for institutional and intellectual reasons, women have clustered more in empirical part of the discipline, for instance, consumption studies and development economics to some extent. One
yeah.
reason for this is that because they had difficulty finding job in academia even after completing a PhD in economics, there were actually new venues for them. So, for instance, home economics department or going into government, okay, like at the BLS in the US, or there were statistical bodies creating everywhere in Europe, in the US. And if it was hard to get a job in academia, you could actually get a job as a sort of labor statistician, for instance, as a woman at the government. So they did more applied work, and it's true that in the 60s, for instance, it was less prestigious. You wouldn't publish much, or you were less visible, and so forth. But if it was the case, as empirical micro became more and more prestigious, you should have seen on its own a sort of feminization of disciplines. Okay. And so we don't have a definite answer for economics, but we have, for instance, evidence from the history of computer science. Then when something that women have been doing becomes more prestigious, they are being replaced by men. And a good example of that is programming. Okay, programmers, if you look at the history of computer science and even the history of applied economics, the 40% of programmers after World War II were women.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
because it was not an elite job. And they were going to have either training on the job or computer science. And what people like Janet Abad or Mayor Hicks or historians of computer science document is that as it became more prestigious, you get a better pay and whatsoever. So like generation of women being replaced with generation of men. So if I don't know what happens, but again, with economics, you shouldn't, even if so I don't have a definite answer, but even if you believe that um, the primacy of theory between the 40s and the 70s was a factor is having a more male-dominated science, you shouldn't conclude that empirical economics becoming more and more prestigious is going to drive women to the top on its own. Okay, because what you might have is sort of new hierarchies in empirical economics as well, in which sort of male-dominated kind of methods would be more prestigious than female-dominated methods. Like, for instance, doing general equilibrium theory or this type of econometrics is more prestigious than, for instance, doing RCT because it's more sophisticated. And
Yeah.
if it happens that you have more men in microeconometrics and more women doing RCT on the field, then in 10 years from now, you can have a pecking order. So you still have women doing empirical work, but now it's less prestigious. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
That's really stuff you've seen in the history of other disciplines.
yeah. It is one of my sort of go-to examples is that history of computers and how women were the first programmers. It's so interesting now because you've got the Silicon Valley bros who are, obviously super prestigious and very well paid and everything, and it's one of the most sought after industries in the world. I think like a lot of people would love to go and work at Silicon Valley, or at least they think they would. So it's like, yeah, it's really interesting. It's what men do accrues prestige, right? Rather than certain subfields being prestigious and men go into the prestigious ones and women go into the unprestigious ones. It's actually more like the causality is reversed potentially.
So that's
Yeah,
what you see in computer science. And
yeah,
so the thing is that if you want to avoid that in economics in the future, you have to set up institutions. So there are lots of, so you want to be careful, for instance, about bias in peer reviewings, about mentorship, about all this stuff that are being studied by applied microeconometry, but about like course evaluation, for instance, and all these things. So you can't expect that things are going to sort out. So that's not what the history of other science have shown, basically, though. So.
yeah. I mean,
And
there's
my worry is that
yeah,
because so economists, what they do right now is that they actually try to identify causes very cleanly. To again, they do apply their own toolbox to themselves, and so they have like really, really good empirical studies of bias in credit or bias in editorship or bias in promotion and tenure clock and stuff like that. So that's really good. But that does not tell you, that's not discussion about structures, incentive structures. And so if all you have in response is having two more John Basic Art medalists that are women and having a Nobel Prize that's a women ones, and everyone in 2002 and 2003 recruiting a woman as assistant professor in every department, and that's it.
yeah.
That's kind of going to be a problem. That's where you actually may want to draw on other types of humanities and social science to address the issue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, some of those studies are really great to underscore the point, right, about citations, well-identified studies about citations, how men get more citations, and men cite themselves more as well than women and stuff like that. But it's like, yeah, you're just limited if you're looking at the effect of X on Y, which is basically what economists are often doing. It's sort of the broader conditions in which X and Y operate are often sort of fall by the wayside, and you don't get that kind of depth. I mean, there was one example. Another example was like if you give people, if you give equal parental leave, right, and so paternity leave as well as maternity leave, which is a nice idea. It's a good idea. But then what happens is the woman just ends up doing all of the work, and the man writes a book. So this was like a study done within academia, I think broadly, not just economics. And it's like, okay, well, you still haven't addressed the problem, right? Because there's still this bias. So you have to look at like deeper issues.
Yeah, and if you, for instance, if you, so Sarson's a study about credit, so if you were a female-male co-authorship and the males get more credit, so you do have a conclusion, and then you haven't got into, for instance, the history of credit and the dynamics of credit. And there's a lot to say about the history of credits in economics and in science more generally, that you need to go into again on history to understand these patterns.
I still can't get over that paper by Heather Sarsons where she wrote it about how women don't get enough credit for their
Yeah.
publications, and the editors of the Journal of Political Economy. I mean, it's almost funny, isn't it? They've combined it. They said we could publish this, but we're going to add a load of stuff to it, and then and it was a solo authored paper, and then it ended up being multiple authored with a bunch of men who'd done like loosely relevant studied, and they just lumped all the papers together. And it was literally about how women don't get enough credit for like authoring papers, originally solo authored, and it was just like you couldn't make it up. It was absolutely ridiculous that.
Yes, so I don't know. I don't want to comment on something I don't know the details on.
Yeah,
I
I do that
know
all
we're
the
not.
time. It's fine. I can do that.
So no, all I can do is basically say it's important, it's career making, please leave archive journals editor, and they would say, oh no, we don't want any historians even in 50 years to actually get their nose into what we're doing. And I'm just like, yeah, this is bad. We absolutely need to have archive for journals. So
Yeah,
that's where I stand. But
yeah,
I do remember Sarsen's an earlier version. The first sentence was that this paper is purposively solo authored, and
yes,
now she cannot have that very good
yeah,
beginning for a paper. So yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. um, so I mean, this is kind of related, and you actually mentioned her earlier, but I was going to ask you, who is your favourite historical economist, and why is it Joan Robinson?
um, my historical economist not a category that I
Is it
have.
that's it's a very loose category. I don't know what that actually means. Thinking about it.
So I don't have favorite. So I that's not so that my answer my go-to answer is I'm not trying to work on my favorite economist. I'm trying to
Okay.
fill holes. So basically, and that's why I get often I get that question that you don't write history of heterodox economists enough, though I do teach a lot
Yeah.
of that. That's my goal is to actually have a sort of spectrum and to tell you what various types of economists were doing inside and outside academia and inside and outside mainstream. But where I do my research as in the history of mainstream economics, because I do believe that that's where you have not enough histories, basically. So I know I'm gonna take some pushback from people in this chat that are Robinson stands, but hey, there's much more history of John Robinson than there are histories of Kenneth Arrow or Ed Prescott.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna work on Kenneth Arrow and Ed Prescott.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that doesn't make me more or less a sort of heterodox. I don't define me as an economist, though I define myself as a very necessary person for economists to have in the economics department. But so I won't pick up sort of my favorite characters. I don't even think of myself as an intellectual, and so my job is not to confront other big intellectuals. So I'm not going to do a history of a biography of Hayek or Keynes
Yeah.
or Smith or whatever. But I think they are very influential people that are understudied. And I don't want to leave that's an ethical sense, but I think the history of the very powerful people should not be left to the next generation of powerful people. I mean,
Right.
historians have to write these histories. And so, history of John Robinson, there are several good biographies, plus heterodox economists do actually have a qualitative culture. Plus, they want to have a sense of their identity, so they do tend to write more histories of their own fields than mainstream economists. So, for instance, I can tell you, I just published a paper on tractability that has Joan Robinson, but the young Joan Robinson, so
Yeah.
not the true Joan Robinson, has a beginning, but I don't have any plans to actually write more. Sorry, on Joan
No,
Robinson at the
it's
moment.
okay. It was a deliberately slightly silly question, but it's interesting how you reflected on your role. Right, it's like you're sort of. Again, I was kind of thinking of an archaeologist when you were speaking. Right, you're like digging up things people haven't seen before, right, and just trying to give them some attention. And you're, I guess, less interested in like stuff that's already been dug up and already been given a lot of attention. Perhaps a more pertinent question though is, um, could you maybe tell us like a very neglected economist that we might not have heard of that you've come across in your archival work?
So they, my job has been to so my response when I was a graduate student was Jacob Marshak. So I
Jacob
was seeing his
Marshak.
name. So since then, people have worked on Jacob Marshak more, but not as much as perhaps they should say. I was seeing his name popping up in everything that people were doing in the 40s and 50s. It was influential because he was the Coles Commission first the president just after the war. But it's kind of these people that I don't talk a lot. And then
Mm.
I did the same again a few years ago while studying the relationship between economics and engineering at Stanford. And I wrote that paper with my co-author Aurélien Saidi, and we actually had like sort of two major figures. One was Kenneth Arrow, that doesn't need any, everyone knows that. But and then to us, the central figures of economics at Stanford, one of the central figures of economics at Stanford from the 70s onward was Bob Wilson. And at that
Bob
time, it was
Wilson.
new to say that, and since then, it actually got a Nobel Prize. But there are others. For instance, some Schultz, as an economist in the U.S.,
Schultz, yeah.
who was president of I think he was at the CEA. I kind of see that kind of guy popping up in sort of the history of public economics, history of urban economics, history of environmental economics. It seems to be so like super, for instance, in macro, I can tell you someone that is super influential and not studied enough is Bob Hall. So I wish people are going to do more about Bob Hole in the future. So I do
Mm.
have a list of names of people. You have also people who know they're super influential, totally escape scrutiny. For instance, there is tons of work on Friedman. There
Yeah.
is kind of nothing on Joe Stiegler.
Yeah.
Why is that, right?
Mm.
So I get that list of, names people should really work more on.
Yeah.
And sometimes even I'm not doing this. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's
yeah.
not. I mean, there's some, but not that much on Bob Lucas as well. I think. I mean, he died
No,
recently, right?
there is kind of plus we actually celebrated the 50th birthday of his paper 72 paper that actually sort of launched that is said to have launched
Yeah.
a um a rational expectation revolution. So
Mm.
there's been a lot done in the past like 3 to 4. So maybe we don't have enough, but we still have a lot more than Ed Prescott, who was
Yeah.
super important both in
Mm.
theoretical and empirical macro. You have like nothing on Wallace if you actually want to go into sort of Minnesota macro. That was like kind of the center of the action in the 80s. So yeah, people in history tend to cluster around some figures. So this is like why Lucas and not Prescott, or why Friedman and not Stigler,
Yeah.
or and I can and I would actually classify Robinson into that group of quite covered people. So there are
Okay.
more people who work on Lynn Ostrom, for instance, but I mean, she's super influential. What she did was super important. Again, not maybe in mainstream economics, but there should be more on her, for instance, as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Edith Penrose is another woman who I feel like she
Yes.
doesn't get that much attention.
No,
She doesn't
I mean,
get enough anyway. Enough anyway.
yeah,
Let's say.
yeah, I didn't mention it because one of my fellow graduate students actually was working on her when I was doing my PhD. So
Ah.
I was reading sort of Penrose. So Clément Levallois has a paper in Hope, no paper in Hope
Mm-hmm.
on Penrose. But there is not much.
Mm.
So for instance, if you want to, so someone is working on that. But if you want to go down the Friedman line, to me, Friedman Schwartz is really Friedman Schwartz, and Anna Schwartz was not Friedman's assistant. She was actually sort
Yeah.
of a empirical wizard. I know that Jen Burns is actually finishing a book on the history of women and Friedman's career. So Rose Friedman, Margaret Reed, and probably she
Oh.
will have a whole chapter on Anna Schwartz, but I cannot explain why so little history of macro on her, because what she did was really important as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting to think about these people. It's why we need people like you as well, right? Because you can't do that all alone.
no,
That's
sure.
like there's a lot of people in there who haven't been studied enough for one reason or another. Um, so I can't. This came up because people in chat. I think it kind of caught your interest, and I made a video about value, and you said that your master's thesis was on value.
And my PhD was on the role of value in theorization and Friedman, Marshak, and Myrdal, basically. So
Okay, okay.
I did
So,
write on
I
that.
mean, insofar as it's possible, are you able to outline like some of the main findings and kind of major themes of it, and at least give us a sort of overview?
So
Because
so what I did basically was avoid like hot stuff, and the obvious hot stuff to avoid was ideology.
yep,
So so I didn't finish my work properly, but my job was actually try to have a predictive answer to people who would say either economics is ideological or economics is not ideological. And so I at first I thought, okay, it's impossible to just like I said earlier, the chicken and egg problem. It's kind of super hard to actually document historically that the stuff that even, for instance, Milton Friedman is doing is ideological. Okay. Because you have a chicken and egg problem. So that's what I did in my PhD was to say, okay, people have worldviews and probably they're going to try to make their worldview consistent. Okay. And so, for instance, if you take Milton Friedman, for instance, is going to say, quote, there is a lucky consistency between my science and my politics.
Yeah.
In that my science shows that markets are efficient. My politics shows that markets are fair.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, I mean, it's consistent. But if you look at his history, I mean, he's got a very specific experience of the Depression, specific experience of war work and price control and all that stuff. And there is no something like my politics came first or my science came first. That's not how it works. Okay. So my PhD was very much about saying we're not going to study that sort of like is ideology first or is science first? We're not going to make it work. We're more going to study the construction of a worldview in which science and politics are made consistent. So that's not satisfying, but that's what I kind of try to do. And then when I actually started teaching these things, I did realize um, that was not satisfactory because I mean the question of ideology was still there, and I still needed to give students or reader a sort of sense of how you can actually ask interesting questions. And my way of seeing it now is that you have sort of like two lines of research on ideology and values. One is basically saying so the values is an individual thing, like Weberian.
Mm.
There is value freedom and value neutrality and value ladness or value relation whatsoever. And we are in the world, and since we are in the world, I mean our research questions are determined by what we're doing and things like that. And so all the questions: did economics manage to actually create mechanism whereby individual values would be pushed out of economics or not? That's one way of, and Kuhn is kind of a bit of that. Then sort of like postmodern people like Putnam, like there is no distinction between facts and value kind of stuff, is still sort of like, yeah, like economists are people in the world, and then they have sort of like views on things, and is economics able to, as a science, try to take the subjective part of it, and should it do so? Because, for instance, feminist economics like Julie Nelson, they will tell you the goal should not be to have a view from nowhere. This is not possible, and this is not even desirable. So that's one way of thinking. And then you have the Marx more like of thinking is like economists are a class and they fit into society and they have class interest. And because they have class interest, like for instance, I guess that's what's behind the idea that neoclassical economics is neoliberal, is more kind of something collective. Okay. So like the
Mm.
body of economics that mainstream economic produce advantages like for marketers or rich people, or if you want to have a basic. And then it's another type of question. Can we actually create some economics that wouldn't have sort of class interest or collective ideology is another type of question. And so the first type of questions, so basically, so people have values, people have personal ideology or whatever you want to call it. Can we push it outside of economics? What economists did is saying, oh yeah, we have peer review, we have mathematization, we have data. Data, sort of like empirical economics, is a disciplining device or whatsoever. So that's one line of thinking about it. Okay, so we should prevent individual ideology from not becoming collective, for instance. And I actually, with time, I got more interesting in the other one, saying, okay, so the standard lines is to say, okay, I think now economists are ideological. Okay, for instance, when they reflect about tax or where they reflect about inflation or where they reflect about distribution. And sometimes their individual views become collective. I'm not very much convinced by that. And this is not this is not quite, this is what I looked into when I was a graduate student, but now that I sit in an economics department, what I see all day is basically people trying to debug codes, or to have a tweak on some model, or to find data and to negotiate about data. So it's super hard to actually come to an economist and to say what you do is ideological. Okay, it's just have no traction. And so what I did basically is to try to investigate the other way of thinking about things, that people would do stuff that are fairly technical and try to, on their daily basis, try to solve technical issues. That's my line of research on tractability, saying, okay, what people are trying to do, mostly economists today, they're trying to make their model tractable. But by doing so, what they do is basically becoming sort of like collectively entrenched in collective norms of writing models. And if you do that, you are actually pushing some problems out of the picture. If I can give you one example, for instance, people have been telling me, I've seen that sort of like op-eds in the Guardian. So do you know representative agent models are ideological? Like purposively so, because when you have representative agent models, you don't have any discussion of redistribution issues and inequality. And so it's the people like Lucas who actually want to push distribution issues on the side and not discuss it, and that's neoliberal. Maybe Lucas actually tried to do that. I'm not sure. I didn't find evidence of this in the archive. I wouldn't say. But what I can tell you is that people actually, maybe not Lucas himself, I don't know, but macroeconomists in the 80s and 90s did use a representative agent because they actually tried to use other stuff and it was just too hard to solve. Okay? And so what you have as sort of like norm that get established because it makes your life easier, but that does create blind spot on the body of economics.
Yeah.
So this is more what I'm trying to do now. So I've really shifted perspective since my graduate year. Sorry,
So,
it was
yeah,
long.
it's not no, but it's not that it's necessarily deliberate that you were trying to cement those values as unquestioned. It's more that it's a consequence of other intellectual developments, right? So I mean, even the optimization thing, right? When you've got an optimizing model, you could argue that that kind of is an ideological bias towards the market system, because if you've got like an optimal outcome, if you're assuming that there's some kind of optimizing function, then you're going to like maximize whatever objective function you have, and that could be utility, which is obviously a good thing. So there's this drive towards optimization, which maybe influences economists to be more pro-market, but that doesn't mean that they picked optimization because they're pro-market. They weren't like, oh, this is the best way for us to like smuggle our pro-market views into the discipline. It was probably more, again, about mathematical tractability, just like the representative agent, right? So, I don't know, that's an accurate characterization of what you're saying, right? And it's like,
It would be
this
as
kind of
there are two things combined
distinction.
here. It's the one is so the tractability would be, for instance, I use that social welfare function because it's easier. But the social welfare function you use actually have ethical underpinning. And there is a second part of the thing is that economists are less willing than they were even 50 years ago to discuss the ethical underpinnings of the tools that they use. Okay. So you were mentioning climate models, and there is that problem with discounting climate models. Okay. And because of Stern
Oops.
and because of Stern being trained in Great Britain with a tradition of welfare economics, you had all that debate on whether we should, what I said earlier, like an hour earlier, about economists trying to not have their own values. People like Nordhaus, what they've been trying to do is say, oh, we're going to take a market discount rate because it's not us. Again, and what Stern was saying is saying, no, discounting is an ethical discussion, and we should explicitly discuss whether we want a discount rate on future generation to be close to zero or something different. So there is both people focused on tractability and just they are actually going to reuse functional firms that make their life easy. And there is also an unwillingness to discuss ethical dimension in a comics model explicitly, I think.
Yeah.
So you get both of these, like creating the kind of, standardization that you mentioned. And so in the
Yeah.
end, when you're actually coming to them, and if you're actually going to say it to someone, okay, dice is ideological, people are going to say that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So you have to, to me, that doesn't really make sense. Say that way. Okay. So the question is, can you actually study and outline economics practice in the way that you're going to go from like so the individual daily routine of economists into how it's being like collective models and the way these collective models are going to be used in policy settings, for
Yeah.
instance. You have to do the whole story, and it's super hard. I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to go. I'm like,
It's a really interesting approach. Do you say you have to go?
yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so
No, I
it's two
realised that
hours already.
we've almost. I
And
know it went really quickly. We've almost reached 6. So yeah. So thanks very much, Beatrice. It's been really really interesting. As I expected it would, to have your perspective.
I hope it wasn't too confused because we went into all
We did
direction,
we
but
did go in all directions, yeah. But it's nice to allow the conversation
so
to
will
flow
I be able
sometimes.
to look at the at some point you were reading comments in the chat, right? Will I be
Yeah.
able to look at that to
Yeah,
see
yes,
what
you
questions?
will be able to look at them on the video afterwards.
Okay,
Regrettably,
great.
people have been arguing about socialism, which always happens on my chats. Guys, this conversation was barely about socialism. You need to stop getting distracted. But for the first hour and a half, it was like it was relevant. So you might want to take a look when I re-upload it. But anyway, thanks everybody for
Thank you so
participating,
much for
and
having me
see you
for the
later,
questions.
Beatrice.
See
Bye
you.
everyone.
Bye.